Hey guys, and welcome to this little chat that I'll be having, and this little discussion that I'll be having with you guys today. And I'll be putting it to some background of me just playing some regular old Minecraft on a little server I play with one of my friends in my dorm. So today I really want to start talking about something about the PSP community and things having to do with that, alongside some of the plans that I have for it in the future. While I'm not really one person who can really control a lot of the community, I have been doing a lot of work in the community, so I'd really like to try to address some of the issues that I see happening right now. So for example, things that are happening such as there's not very many developers, and even though I am on the PSP Discord server, a lot of the developers are not actively working on projects, or a lot of projects are being delayed due to work and external factors like that, and that's completely fine. I do expect it because most developers have a life, me included, of course. But I still feel that there's some sort of tie to the community that I have, and some sort of responsibility for me to continue doing that. And maybe that's because I do YouTube videos and things like that, where I directly interact with subscribers and fans and things like that. So yes, I know I'm saying things like that a lot, generally because I have generally because I record on the fly and I don't really have a pre-planned script or anything for what I want to say. But it's also kind of disappointing because if you look like a forum like Wololo, which was very active many years ago on the PSP scene, and was where a lot of the people who used to do a lot of the programming were, it's kind of died down. In fact, I think we went about 3 or 4 weeks on the homebrew side, where there was literally no posts except for literally just me doing development. So I really would say that the PSP homebrew scene is sort of dying, but sort of still alive, somewhat, because the PSP is still considered a retro console and people do like to play games on it. And I definitely see that with the Reddit, as I've seen that Reddit has majorly influenced the number of views that I get on some of my videos. Sometimes they're comprising over 50% of the views, which is kind of crazy. That would be the version 0.3 Minecraft PSP release. But I would say that there is still an active fan base and an active group of people who are still wanting to do the community. People who aren't necessarily developers, but people who still, like using their PSP and consuming content on it. And that's really sort of the issue. Right now we have a large market that has a lot of demand, but we don't really have much of a supply to keep that going. So whatever work that does get done has quite a bit of a community behind it. And now, while I'd like to be able to just single-handedly push a lot of stuff forwards, that's not going to happen. No matter how many games I decide to port, it's not going to really take over the same span of time that it would if I had multiple developers working. And I'm not necessarily saying that I want to create a team or anything like that, but I was also sort of thinking that there needs to be more developers actively working on projects and things like that. So what I want to try to do is, as I was talking earlier in the Slender PSP video, that I wanted to sort of create a game engine that would be simple and easy to use, so that people could start making their own games or start doing just their own little things. And eventually some of those will become really nice, really good projects, and with that engine we could do quite a bit. So that's a project that I really want to start pretty soon, and I'll be starting as soon as Slender PSP is done. I've seen some interest in having multiple console sort of support for different things, such as 3DS and things like that. And while I don't know enough about those necessarily to make my own engine that would effectively be able to target those audiences, I would definitely be able to make an engine in such a way that if people wanted to add those on, they could do that for people who are more experienced in those sort of homebrew scenes. And as I find it, I do tend to have quite a bit of time where I can do work and do things like that to help advance the scene and do things like that. I really don't want this the PSP scene to really die or anything like that, especially since I've been really an actively engaged member in it since probably 2011. I was probably starting to lurk around, and then more around 2015, 2016 was when I just first tried to break into it, and then obviously 2018, 2019 with Recraft, and then specifically Minecraft for the PSP, which I'm still working on, and Slender for the PSP now too. So I'm pretty involved in it, and I really want to keep it going. And I know that a lot of people have problems where they can't necessarily always be working and things like that, and I definitely understand that. But it really comes from a lot of different issues, to be honest. There isn't a very big supply of people who are working on it, and there's not going to be a big supply of games due to that. Also, if I completed this engine, I'd also like to make some simple tutorials on how to use it and things like that. Usually, I'll probably also add like scripting support, so you could use something. I don't want to do Lua. I want to do something more like Python. I'm not sure if that's possible, but depending on that, we could do an interpreted language so that people who are even beginners at programming could start creating their own games and start doing their own ports. And while I assume it's not going to be like of the highest quality or necessarily anything like that, we're not really expecting that from basically just scripting languages. And I suppose that's also true of some things. But if you have some experience, or if you do know a bit about programming, or you're just a very logical person who puts a lot of time into things, you definitely could make a very good game. Like, for example, one Lua engine is not a very frequently used Lua engine for the PSP, and it certainly isn't necessarily the most feature-rich. For example, the first-person camera is not really working first-person camera. It was really made as more of a demo, I feel like, at least, for the PSP. For the PS Vita, I feel like it's a lot more fleshed out than it is on the PSP. But even through that, I can still make a relatively decent Slender port, just doing that. Of course, there's some problems with the actual engine itself, as will always be with any sort of engine, but I really do feel like we could really push ahead if we just had a brand new engine, because I know that a lot of the developers who are on the PSP Homebrew server really like to use Quake and things like that, that have a really standardized system, and Quake is a very, very simple system to get into as well, for Quake C and things like that. So my goal would be to make something that could be rival that in simplicity while having a better framework, because the original Quake engine is pretty based on old code from what I've collected from developers, and no one really has made a really new and improved version of that. Furthermore, I know that there is a project that's kind of being a Unity for old consoles type thing that I saw on the Mr. Irons yearly post on GBA Temp. And while that's still in progress, I don't believe that there's necessarily going to be the same sort of necessarily PSP specific on it as what I'm proposing to try to do. I'd also like to try to make this new engine something that could definitely outperform older engines, or it could definitely benefit from newer C++ features, including C++ 17. And I'd rather try to make it into like a C++ API alongside a more scripting language type subset. I do honestly feel that if this project really does well, and if I can do a lot to get it done, I believe that it will definitely help in bringing more games to the PSP and bringing a lot more bigger talent and things like that into the scene as well. I have a relatively decent experience with building some game engines, usually smaller things and stuff like that, and I do feel that I can make a pretty well optimized and well-performing version made specifically just for the PSP. With that said, we could probably do a bunch of expansions and things on that in the API itself, and in doing that we could probably create something similar to the PSP SDK, but through a more wrapped and interpreted version, so that if you wanted to do things, you don't necessarily have to completely do it just through raw hardware calls, because I know that that is also a pretty big problem for people trying to get into it. That being said, I do want to make the game engine sort of extensible so that people can add onto it with their own sort of modules and things like that in order to continue to expand the capabilities that it will have. And while this design might not be the best for overall size, it's probably going to be a relatively big project, I still think that it would definitely help out a lot of the scene, and I definitely feel that if I could create a reasonably big and performant version of it, that it would be an effective tool to continue to help the PSP scene, hopefully revive it and give it a renaissance. I do feel like people mischaracterize or misjudge the PSP's strength, seeing that most people only have used one CPU, and as well as its graphical strength as well. So I believe that through this we could probably do some pretty cool demos and things like that with a better graphics engine, So for example, we could do a bunch of different more unusual type things that you wouldn't usually see people be doing on this type of thing by doing things like vertex shaders, fragment shaders, and maybe even ray tracing, depending, using the ME as a secondary CPU, which is responsible for post-process operations, because if you do the logic behind it, there's 272 pixels by 480 pixels is the entire display of the PSP, so that's a pretty big number. And you take 333 megahertz, which is 333, 333, 333, divided by that number of pixels, and that's how many operations you can do per pixels per second. Which means that if you have that many operations per second, you divide that by your target frame rate, whether that be 60 or 30, and then once you've hit that target frame rate, then you actually have a fully working system where you can have that many operations per second, and that turns out to be at the full scale resolution of 480 by 272 of being about 42 or 43 pixel operations per second, which means that you could reasonably do a small amount of effects on it, doing things like tone mapping, things like that, and you could probably create some pretty optimized algorithms to do more features like that. Furthermore, just by using some simple blit logic and things to that on the screen, you could also probably manage to convey a very good FPS. You could probably do motion blur, you could probably do tone mapping, color changes, stuff like that. You might even be able to get away with doing more blurring type effects, because blurring kernels are pretty cheap as well. It's just an additive kernel of, let's say, if we're doing a 5x5 Gaussian blur, it's 5 things that are multiplied and then added. I'm not sure if the RISC 4000 has an FMA, which is the fuse multiply add operator, or anything like that that could optimize that, but you could definitely do things like that in order to make it more graphically appealing and add a lot more detail to the scene, which would be pretty much running it at basically free. If you did that, now your main CPU can do basically all the rest of the main game functions, which would be not too much. It would just be rendering all the scenes, and it would be processing whatever you wrote in your script. Through this, a lot more complicated and visually compelling games would be made, and that would really help the PSP scene a lot, because if you have a very nice looking game that's very, very visually appealing, people are going to want to play that a little bit more because of how it looks. For example, like if GTA 5 looked like garbage, no one's going to play GTA 5. But GTA 5 is a visually stunning game, and it's got a lot of quality content in it, and that's the reason why we play it. We can do open world games and stuff like that. So I really find it important to try to nail down this more ambitious project and try to actually accomplish it. So I'll be starting that relatively soon, of course, as I said, at the end of the Slender PSP project, which should be getting done pretty soon. So with this type of video and sort of commentary, I'd really like a lot more of your guys' opinions in this matter, and I really want to sort of feel out how other people are perceiving it as well, especially developers, how they will see it as well, or people who are actually interested in developing, actually, since I do want to make tutorials for it, because it would be pretty simple. It would be Python, something like that, where it's very easy to write. So I really hope you guys have sort of enjoyed this more discussion-y type video, and I thank you guys a lot for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later today, actually, with Minecraft Modded Survival, and then tomorrow with Minecraft PSP update.